All right. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees. Thank you for coming on time. We really appreciate all the support we've had in this Dialogues in European Jain Studies speaker series, and this is the last event for this academic year, and we're excited to say that we're already planning what may come next year. We can talk about that more later if you want. I'm Professor Christopher Jane Miller, and this event is titled The Future of Jain Studies, as you see here on the slide. I'm really excited to do this event because it's going to not only be me just talking to you, but it's also going to be my wonderful collaborators from University of Birmingham and Ghent University who've really helped me and helped you enjoy this experience for this whole speaker series. So we're really excited to talk to you directly, as well as to bring you into conversation with our global collaborators. And so a big thing we want to emphasize in this particular event is that European Jain Studies is, of course, a global Jain Studies. There are Europeans around the world doing Jain Studies. There are Europeans in Europe doing Jain Studies. And they're doing Jain Studies with people who are not from Europe and who are in other parts of the globe. And so this is a really exciting opportunity for us to kind of collaborate and show you the different methodologies that we're using that are transnational, across seas, across borders. And the last thing we really want to emphasize as we go into this event is that we have titled it The Future of Jain Studies. But of course, there are many futures of Jain Studies in the plural. And so we welcome all contributions here, and we look forward to a productive conversation and dialogue with you all about the many potential futures of this wonderful discipline. So with that being said, there's a Q&A box as always. You're welcome to put your questions in there, and we'll answer them when we get to the end of the event with the time that we have. And we look forward to hearing from you. So we'll get it kicked off. We'll jump right into it. I'm going to go right into my talk because we have quite a bit of things we want to share with you today. I am going to be talking particularly about Engaged Jain Studies and Engaged Jainism, as you see below me here. Here's a mock-up of the cover of our new book that's coming out, Engaged Jainism, Critical and Constructive Approaches to the Study of Jain Social Engagement, which I'm editing with my colleague, Professor Cogen Bohanec, who's also here with us today. And what we want to do with you tonight is share with you the methodology of Engaged Jain Studies and Engaged Jainism that we've developed in this volume, in dialogue with our collaborators, in dialogue with Jains, in dialogue with scholars, and really present and share that to you so you can see what it's about. We also have a citation down there if anybody's interested in citing some of this before it comes out. It will be out with SUNY Press soon. So Jains are engaging the world. Jain ideas are engaging the world. Jains are working with scholars all over the world. And we love this. And this has been a really wonderful time for Jain Studies. We've seen it expanding. And therefore, we want to think about what it means to engage in all these various ways. And we want to really theorize it in a way that is methodologically rigorous and potentially helpful for other scholars to enter into this subdiscipline that we're calling Engaged Jain Studies, for which we also have an MA program at Claremont School of Theology that you'll hear more about later. Now, in order to theorize this field, what we've done is we've really looked at this term engage. What does this mean in the context of Jain studies? By looking at these four categories: engaged universals, engaged scholars, engaged learning, and engaged Buddhism. So these four frameworks I'll explain right now for how they inform the way that we're using the term engaged when we talk about this discipline. When we talk about engaged universals, we're particularly looking at the work of anthropologist Anna Singh, who all the way back in 2005 used this term, engaged universals, to refer to the way that culturally transformative processes occur when universal epistemic systems, such as neoliberal ideology, science, and other things, come into contact and produce frictions within local contexts where they're being studied anthropologically with alternative cultural logics. And what happens, and this happens with the Jain tradition as well, is when these universal systems, of course, travel across cultural spaces, they are changed, and the space with which they are interacting is changed as well. It's very productive cultural frictions. In the Jain tradition, quick example, and you'll see more from my colleagues soon, veganism is a good example. Many Jains are drawing from transnational vegan movement, which is not Jain in itself, but are seeing opportunities in that to transform their own tradition globally, and are transforming their own tradition globally as they draw from the vegan movement to enact their own principles of ahimsa, compassion, and so forth. We also consider in this volume how Jain ideas and universal Jain wisdom and when philosophy comes into contact with academic ways of knowing from the Western academy. And when these come together, the kind of frictions that are produced and how the scholar and the community can both be transformed simultaneously. So it's very dialogical. The second way that we're using the word engaged here is we're using it in the context of what's known as the engaged scholar. And particularly, I like the work of Garrett Broad, who's studying ethnographically with Black communities who are growing their own food, and they're trying to make some kind of positive social change. In Broad's book, he says that some scholars, and here for us, some Jain scholars, we could say, are participating in everyday struggles for social justice, trying to make the world a better place in some way, shape, or form. And the engaged scholar very rigorously, therefore, produces scholarly knowledge while simultaneously conducting research that may help research participants advance, facilitate, and reflect upon their own social change efforts. So once again, this is dialogical. It's scholars working with the community to advance some kind of project, some kind of initiative to make the world a better place. And in this case, it would be with the Jain community, of course, and of course, this is already happening. The third way we use engaged in this volume is with regard to pedagogy, engaged learning, which in an article I wrote back in 2019 could involve, for example, experiential learning experiences that take place within particular communities, collaborative undergraduate projects aimed at addressing real social challenges, and transformative intercultural exchanges intended to expose students to alternative worldviews. One of the things that students often say they love the most during their semester class, especially undergraduates, is when they get to go and hang out with the Jains at the temple, in a community, in some kind of community initiative, and the experience that they have, the transformative experience they have, what they learn from that engaged experience of learning. And finally, of course, we're drawing from the field of engaged Buddhism. We've learned a lot from this field, which has a long history. This, of course, is a field that studies Buddhist social engagement. The term engaged Buddhism is, of course, an emic term coined by Thich Nhat Hanh from within the tradition. And we're using engaged Jainism and engaged Jain studies as more edict terms, as you'll see, to kind of look at the way that Jains engage socially, because Jains are not calling themselves engaged Jains or engaged Jainism. So we acknowledge that we're creating a field to try to capture what we're seeing anthropologically, philosophically, historically, and so forth. So we are also learning a lot from this field, engaged Buddhism. They made a lot of mistakes. They've taught us so much about how this can be done in better ways over the years, and recently have come up with a lot of self-critique that we need to take seriously, and which we do in our volume. So for example, there was a recent article, which you see down below here by Lele, on disengaged Buddhism. Not all Buddhists want to be engaged or should be engaged from the perspective of their particular philosophical positions. The same could be for Jains. So we also need to consider Jain social disengagement if it arises, and take that seriously within the methodologies that we use. We also want to be very self-reflective because, as Sue recently pointed out, this field, engaged Buddhism, in many ways became a very privileged, very white, very baby boomer kind of creation that they call academic engaged Buddhism. And we want to avoid being extractive, avoid being colonial, avoid not addressing the power dynamics that occur between scholars and their participants and the ideas that they're working with. We also don't want to overlook things like abuse, anything that happens that might not look so good. We don't want to cover that up. We want to really bring out everything that's happening when we're studying what we call engaged Jainism. We also want to look, of course, at women's roles, gender, and many different intersectional approaches to the Jain tradition in light of all the other things that are going on in the world. So this is really trying to take a comprehensive approach at the way that Jains approach social engagement, as well as the way that Jain principles could potentially be applied towards social engagement. And finally, with regard to engaged Buddhism, we also want to show, and we do in this book, that engaged Jainism, of course, looks quite different because we recognize the unique individualistic approaches to karma and the soul that are characteristic to Jain doctrine and praxis, very different from engaged Buddhism, and which shape Jain social engagement. So we're using the term engaged in these very precise and very particular ways, and we really, really want to make this subdiscipline as rigorous as possible. Now, within our volume, Engaged Jainism, the mock-up of the cover, which you see here, again, we propose, therefore, 3 models of engaged Jain studies, because we want this to be a very inclusive approach and capture as much of the work that we already see happening in the field of Jain studies, as part of this project of what we're calling Engaged Jainism and Engaged Jain Studies. And those are the constructive reproductive, the critical analytical, and the critical constructive methods and approaches to the study of the Jain tradition. I'm going to go through each of these briefly with you to show you what I mean. So the constructive reproductive model is one that reproduces emic Jain discourse in scholarship. Going to John Court's very famous article from 1990, this is an internal model of scholarship for the Jains. Sometimes he called it perhaps a defense mechanism at times. And it reproduces approaches to the study of the Jain tradition, as we highlight in the history that we outline in our book, that was initiated by Romantic Orientalist European and American scholars of the 19th century and beyond, who were searching for the quote-unquote lost treasure from Indian religions. Flugel called these way back in 2005 Jain theosophists. One example of this is, of course, Herbert Warren's book, Jainism in Western Garb, which was written by Warren in dialogue with Veerchand Gandhi. So you see these engagements happening for a long time between sort of middle-class Euro-Americans and Jains from India, who are trying to share Jain values with the world in various ways, and often in the English language, for example. Here, Warren writes, "I have been asked to write a manual of Jain doctrine. This I am not competent to do, but I make the request a very welcome opportunity for trying to present to the world that which Mr. Gandhi gave me, and which I hold in the very highest esteem as being of priceless value." So there you have it. That is the constructive reproductive model of Jain studies, of Engaged Jain Studies. The second model that we propose is the critical analytical model. Once again, drawing from Court's excellent article from 1990 that's been so formative for the field of Jain studies, we are critically analyzing emic Jain discourse in this kind of scholarship. This is a scholarly model of the Jains, right? It uses critical analytical models to look at the Jains in a so-called objective way. But of course, we know that objectivity itself is something that can be historically located. And so this particular approach would study Jain engagements with the world using interdisciplinary tools, including critical historical, anthropological, philological, and philosophical methods and frameworks. If the former were the Jain theosophists, these might be the Jain orientalists or Indologists. And this has roots, instead of in things like projects like Herbert Warren, this has roots, of course, in colonial projects, Indological projects. Here's an example from Colebrook all the way from 1809, who says that the Jains' precaution to avoid injuring any being is a practice inculcated in the Orthodox religion, but which has been carried by them to a ludicrous extreme. Now, of course, scholars using this particular approach would not say things like that today. We're much more self-reflexive, but the point is that no scholarly endeavor is free of historical framework and context. And so what we're trying to do is contextualize the various models that exist and therefore propose a third model, the critical constructive, which we also see happening in the field of Jain studies. This would draw from both the critical analytical and constructive reproductive models that I've just shown you. It would be, once again, borrowing language from John Court's article, a study both of and for the Jains. It engages the edict with the emic, and in the process remains open to the transformation of both scholars and Jains, especially as they come to work together so closely in the contemporary moment, where we see Jain studies just burgeoning, just such a growing field. A really wonderful example of this that I always come back to is this book by Anna Bajel and Brian Donaldson, and Anna you will hear from later, Insistent Life, right? This is a book on Jainism in relation to contemporary bioethical issues, whose dual approach of excavating foundational principles and deducing principles of application seeks to make a meaningful contribution to future scholarship and clinical analysis in Jainism and bioethics. It takes a really rigorous approach to defining what Jain philosophy and bioethics might look like, and then it brings it into conversation with contemporary bioethical issues and opens up a lot of future directions for research. We find this to be a wonderful example of the critical constructive approach to the Jain tradition, and we, of course, employ this quite a bit at Arihanta Institute as well as in the volume, but we welcome all and we feature all of the three models I have just shown you. So in conclusion, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, and I just wanted to point out two things that we are doing right now at Arihanta Institute and at Claremont School of Theology. You will hear from my colleagues there now that are grappling with how to do this kind of method and approach. Professor Jonathan Dickstein and I are going to be teaching a course, Jainism, Veganism, and Engaged Religion, to show how this manifests with regard to the way the Jain tradition is currently interacting with the transnational vegan movement. So if anybody's interested in exploring how this methodology works and how we put it into play, this is a wonderful short course that we'll be teaching in June for you to do that. And then we also have our Master of Arts in Engaged Jain Studies, where we are teaching these methods and using them throughout. And so you hear about these things from my colleagues in what will follow. I now turn it over to my colleague, Professor Cogen Bohanec. Thank you very much for listening.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Miller. I appreciate that very much. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways we can understand the taxonomy and the hierarchical relationship between methodology and methods. And what Dr. Miller just gave us was a really broad overview of some of the methodologies or methods that we can see in the general discipline, the burgeoning discipline of Engaged Jain Studies. What I wanted to underscore here are some of the other methodological approaches that are covered in the volume by other scholars. And so by doing this, I'm going to just show a brief outline of the book. I'm going to try to keep these comments really, really brief. But basically, you can see in the construction of the edited volume itself, there's 6 basic sections, right? The first one is a critical issues, which would be really like the critical analytical approach that Dr. Miller just mentioned. We have social engagement in the diaspora, business and economy, ethics, animals, which is a big area of Jain discourse and Jain studies currently, also with the environment, and then also interfaith issues as well. Now, I could just go through a few of these sections really quickly and show what some of the scholars are doing. So talking more about the critical issues in Engaged Jain Studies, like the critical analytical approach, Steve Weiss is a great example of this, and he talks about how the applied Jainism, which is very similar to Engaged Jainism, is part of the charters of many of the endowed chairs that we're seeing, and how this bolsters an identitarian narratives, which really focuses on issues of environments and animals and food, but neglects other issues of human rights, civil rights, anti-fascism, anti-racism, anti-casteism, etc. So this is one way of looking at what's being uplifted, and at the same time what is being neglected in the discourse around engaged or applied Jainism. Tine Wickermans, she writes this wonderful piece on Jain mantra healing and contemporary issue around mantra healing. And this creates a lot of these sort of epistemic frictions that Dr. Miller just mentioned, how to be a scholar, to be sensitive to the emic sort of self-understandings of the tradition, but also maintaining what we might call your own edict non-negotiables, especially when you talk about like healing claims with mantras, healing various different diseases. It's a very, very wonderful read. It's very intellectually stimulating and a little unsettling too, but it's a really nice example of what these epistemic frictions can happen in a sort of critical analytical approach that necessarily happens when worldviews come together. All right, then we have social engagement in the diaspora. Dr. Miller, you may have seen him present on this recently, his work on the sociology of art on Dr. Narendra Kumar Jain's mural on the Berlin Wall. And this is really an engagement between East and West, is how the self-understanding of the muralist is here. Also, the historical moment of the Cold War, and then how it's refurbished in the 21st century. And there's all these various different engagements between modern art, Indian modern art, and more contemporary mainstream modern art. So we see a lot of diasporic issues there. And of course, Irfan's work, which I think many of us are familiar with, is work in Southeast Asia, the diasporic Jains in Thailand, and what it means to be a minority religion that's engaged with the majority cultural hegemony and to still have various different survival mechanisms within that. Okay, so that would be our diaspora engagements, but we also have business and economy, which of course is a really important issue in the Jain community, with Zeng's work on philosophy and ethics, and he really talks about in mainstream ethical pedagogy, particularly business ethics, there's a lack of normative in what I would say meta-ethics or ontological questions, where ethics are just sort of grasped as this sort of instrumentalist, almost consequentialist framing without any real broader understanding of normative ethics and meta-ethics, and how Jain philosophical understanding of business ethics can really address that lack. We see a similar thing with Atul Shah, who really brings to us a lot of what the modern business community can learn from Jain business practices and Jain ethics. And then, of course, we have animals. I read a piece here. I'm working very deeply on virtue ethics and Jain tradition, which is very much an engagement between the sort of normative ethical system, particularly of Alistair MacIntyre, and traditional Jain ethics. Again, two different epistemes coming together to see how the language from one can be used on the other. Then we have Andrew Bridges, who talks about Arihanta as a basis for plurality and respecting animals. This is something that's very familiar discourse within the Jain studies and Jain community. And then Jonathan Dickstein brings a really good example of like applied ethics with the animal sanctuary that's run by Jains in Colorado. A lot of work that he's done there too. And then Tuminello does this great work on foaming and the ethical concerns, taking those concerns seriously, where at the same time, there can be problematic issues with foaming, but doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't be practiced or done. So very interesting engagement there with a very important contemporary movement in animal advocacy. Okay, so in the environment section right here, I had this article from Shivani Botra about Acharya Tulsi and how his Anuvrat movement creates a system of ethics that can really be applicable to broad issues in the contemporary era. She doesn't focus specifically as much on environmentalism, but it is in there. And I'm also writing another work on Jain eco-theology that will go in this section as well too, which would be a constructive, like a critical constructive approach, as Dr. Miller would put it. Okay, and then our final section would be the interfaith engagement that we see with Alba Rodriguez, and the textual hermeneutics that she's doing on the Bhavanas, a very well-known enumeration of various different lists of ethics that have universal appeal across different Dharmic traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. So that sort of shared framing creates sort of interfaith engagement there. Corinna Laura, she does the Yoga Pradipa, and then also how that's engaged with Jain, with Hindu Patanjali Yoga Sutra and other philosophical systems. And then Dr. Long asked this wonderful provocative question of whether one can arrive at similar understandings of Anekantavad from different philosophical starting points. And in his case, he does this sort of interfaith engagement with a Vedanta. So that's basically the various different methodological approaches that the scholars in our volume are taken. But I will note one more thing that Jonathan Dickstein said to us recently in a call. He says, is it Engaged Jain Studies or is it Engaged Jain Studies? And I think this is a really succinct way of saying a lot of what Dr. Miller said, and the answer is really both. You know, we're trying to create a very inclusive umbrella. So it's Engaged Jains, so we're studying Jains who are engaged in the world as scholars, but then also seeing how Jain studies itself can be engaged in various different contemporary important philosophical issues. So I'll stop my presentation at that, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jonathan Dickstein.
Thank you so much, Cogen. So I'm a scholar of South Asian religions with an ever-increasing focus on Jain traditions, but my overarching interdisciplinary project seeks to bring religious studies into conversation with human animal studies, and specifically critical animal studies. So akin to how Engaged Jain Studies takes a critical constructive approach to Jain studies, critical animal studies insists on a critical constructive approach to human animal studies. So without getting too tongue-tied about it, I simply understand both of these fields, Engaged Jain Studies and critical animal studies, as embracing an ethical commitment to make the world a better place, tangibly, materially so, for humans and non-humans alike. And I also embrace this commitment myself. So in my own research, I explore two manifestations of engaged Jainism that relate to the plights of non-human animals, but plights that have immense import for various reasons for the well-being of human communities. On another day, I would love to discuss how disentangling human and non-human welfare is rather antithetical to Jain thought and even social justice broadly understood. But the first manifestation of engaged Jainism I work on is the traditional but ever-evolving practice of Jain vegetarianism and its public promotion. I focus on the modern and contemporary reformulations of the Jain diet, especially in the European and North American diasporas. This area is not novel as for decades, prominent Jain scholars, some of whom are here today, have researched modifications not only to Jain diasporic diets, but also the motivations for these diets. What was once largely a gaze inward towards one's personal participation in violence and resultant karmic accumulation has become, perhaps even dominantly, a gaze outward towards systems of industrialized agriculture and the consequences of these systems for sentient organisms, even future generations of them. Previously individualized and now oriented discourses on diet and consumption are now mandating wider concerns about carbon emissions, water quality, wastewater, air quality, water quality, exploited human labor, and the viability, if not also basic ethicality of globalization and capitalism. While relatively small in scale, the emergence of Jain veganism in the diaspora is one such indication of an evolving ethical gaze. The second manifestation is my work on the Jain animal sanctuary, or Pundrapal. I'm involved in ongoing fieldwork at Love and Arms Animal Sanctuary, a Gujarati Jain-founded farmed animal refuge in Erie, Colorado. And I regard this particular site as a fascinating nexus of the enduring Jain practice of animal rescue, the modern Western farmed animal sanctuary movement, the ethical complexities of rescue and caregiving, and related discourses around effective or impactful animal advocacy and activism. My guiding research question is this: what does nonviolence demand in its anumata valence, that is, in its active unwillingness to sanction proximal events and institutions of violence? Restraints are one part of nonviolence, but what about intervention? For farmed animal sanctuaries, this imperative to intervene is expressed not only in the mere rescuing of animals from acts of violence, but also through constant efforts to promote animals' ongoing thriving. In this manner, the modern farmed animal sanctuary movement innovates even upon the Jain Pundrapal, with its emphasis on enrichment in addition to safety. So Jain veganism and the animal sanctuary are the two aspects of engaged Jainism that I study. But the engaged part of Engaged Jain Studies also implicates me as a scholar doing Jain studies in a way that is also concerned and engaged with the material world, similar to what Cogen referred to earlier. And this is an implication I proudly shoulder. And I also employ that critical constructive approach described by Christopher Miller, the approach that is, quote, both of and for the Jains, engaging the etic with the emic, and in the process, remaining open to the transformation of both, end quote. So in sum, personal transformation and socially conscious action motivated by that transformation could hardly be more urgent. Engaged Jain Studies is one way to contribute, and at Arihanta Institute and Claremont School of Theology, this is our way to get there, to contribute to a more just and peaceful world. So with that, my colleague at CST, Venu Mehta.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jai. Good morning to all who are joining from the morning slot. I'm invited by our collaborators, Arihanta Institute professors, basically to talk about MA in Engaged Studies that we offer in partnership with Arihanta Academy and Claremont School of Theology. The partnership is entering into its second year, and we are very happy to announce that it's really hit a success. So basically, I would there would be another day I would talk about how we offer Jain Studies courses at CST. But if we focus mainly about the MA in Engaged Jain Studies courses offered by Arihanta Institute and Claremont School of Theology, then it basically really matches with the Claremont School of Theology's values such as compassion, justice, and belonging. which we basically believe are nothing else but something related to really engaged, to be an engaged. And following that, the courses that are being offered in this program are meant to form community leaders, scholars, researchers, and activists, but using the frame and lens of Jain studies, Jainism, Jains, so both emic and etic. And so I believe that, I guess, the engagement with the community members as the students go for a lot of field work, doing a lot of interreligious studies as well, and also doing vegan studies, Jain yoga. So there are several avenues that students are exploring through this program and the courses that are being offered. I won't go much into methods and methodological discussions, but these courses and the programs are certainly are giving an avenue and window and opportunity for students to engage with the Jain philosophy doctrines as well as community living, but using the philosophy, learning, and wisdom in order to engage in their day-to-day life as a community leaders, as a visionaries, as a researchers and scholars. So thank you very much, and I'll now hand over to Chris.
Thank you so much to my collaborators for sharing with us some details about Engaged Jain Studies. We'll look forward to discussing that more in the Q&A. And I now want to immediately hand it over to our next little sub-panel here after this one, to Marie-Laine Gorse, who will now take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, and also Cogen and Jonathan and Venu for your groundbreaking engaged work. So it's also wonderful to have all your projects in mind for what we are going to focus on now, because what distinguishes Jaina meditation from another type of meditation, Jaina ecological awareness from another type of ecological awareness, or Jaina sustainable business models from another type of sustainable business models, is Jaina philosophy. That is the theoretical framework that explains why we should pursue these lines of practice in view of the nature of the world, in view of our own nature, and in view of our position in the world. So what I mean is that for all these wonderful engaged projects to be fruitful, serious history matters. So we need to look at those who did this well in the past and who have passed the test of time. We need to really assimilate the textual traditions of Jainism. And so that's what I wanted to talk about a bit here. But before I say anything else, let me say that I'm thrilled to have with me two world specialists who are close colleagues and dear friends, Anna Weigel from the University of California, Riverside, and Anil Mundra, who is finishing a postdoc at Rutgers and soon to be assistant professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So the three of us will discuss really what has been done, what is being done, and what is hoped for in the subfield that is Jaina philosophy. Yes, so first of all, a very, very quick history. We all know that Indologists of the past centuries, they have focused a lot on textual philosophy, with Jacobi, Schubring, or Deleuze, especially on the Shvetambara canon. Such that today there is a lingering feeling that all has been done in Jaina philosophy, especially since there was an important and very much needed turn on material culture, on the practice of communities, on literature. However, we are here to convince everybody that the state of affair is actually quite different. A lot is still to be done on Jain texts of philosophy. This is an incredibly huge project, so huge that under the leadership of Acharya Tulsi, there is since 1954 this Therapant project of a critical edition of the Agamas, Huge achievements have been made in terms of editions, in terms of vernacular translations, of word indexes, and a lot of other tools, research tool. And Nalini Balbir has just gave a wonderful presentation on all this at the annual meeting at SOAS. And yet, despite these huge projects, still so much is still to be done. So even if we look at the Shvetambara canon, even there we still need critical editions and English translation of most of the works, and what to say about the Shatkanga Agama. And even the most well-known works like the Tadvarta Sutra, I don't know how we could translate it, the treatise on what there is, or something like this. Even this type of works, they lack thorough academic investigation. For example, here, the Bhashya, the commentary of the Tadvarta Sutra, has not yet been entirely translated in English. So as you can imagine, the same observation can be made of later authors. For example, one philosopher that I take as one of the most important authors in Jaina philosophy is Akalanka. None of his texts are yet translated into English. So what I want to say is that Jaina philosophy is an ocean of knowledge, really, Jnana Sagara. And we still need today thorough and in-depth investigations of it if we want to navigate these waters. So we need really more critical editions. We still need more translations in various languages, including English, and we need supports on learning languages. Because you know that also most of the department of philosophy or of religious studies in which specialists like me in Jaina philosophy are, those departments regularly do not offer language courses. But this is very important. And I think a lot of projects, especially I'm thinking of the Prakrit summer schools, and like a lot of projects are here to help in that direction. And the second, so we still need a lot of work in translation and edition, and we still need to work on Jaina philosophy in its own rights. And the second point that I wanted to make is that the academic studies of Jain philosophy, in it, the focus in the last decennies has been almost exclusively on epistemology. That is to say, there was a huge focus on the ways to acquire new knowledge. How can we know better through reasoning, through argumentation, through authoritative discourses, or through perception of the senses? No, this research has regularly been done with a Western perspective on what it means to be a systematic doctrine, following precise laws of rationality. And little to no attention was given to the broader picture. Just to give you an example, scholars usually focus on chapter 1, 2, and 5 of the Tadvarta Sutra, that is to say on the categories of reality, on the nature of the soul, and on the types of substance, leaving the rest as not systematic, maybe why not important, while the rest is the lower and middle regions, the gods, the influx of karma, the vows, the bondage, the inhibiting and the wearing off of karma and liberation. So recently, scholars have realized more and more how important these other chapters were, and we are starting to link theories of knowledge with karma theory, and also with cosmology, with meditation techniques, and with the practices, the Jain practices. So there is a significant shift happening here right now. So stay tuned. But I think I have spoken enough. I just mainly wanted to focus on these two big shifts, because my colleagues have other shifts to share as well. So Anna, if you could speak next, thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie-Hélène, for the kind invitation to contribute to this discussion and for sharing these valuable suggestions on how we might envision the future study of Jain philosophy. I would like to add just 2 points which are linked by a common theme of interconnection. So first, to start with, I find it imperative to keep reminding ourselves that no Jain philosophical text was created in isolation. Firstly, Jain philosophical texts often build on rich doctrinal histories and commonly don't clarify many terms and ideas they assume their targeted audiences to know. This should encourage us not to study Jain texts in isolation from the Jain sources that either preceded them or were produced contemporaneously. Secondly, Jain philosophical ideas cannot be found only in what are traditionally considered philosophical texts. As others have emphasized, it's important to explore a broad diversity of genres and sources in which we might find them. Working on Jain ethics has also taught me that normative ideas are applied in practice in complex and often unexpected ways, and it would be wonderful to see more future work exploring the relationship between the two. Thirdly, Jain philosophical ideas arose in particular intellectual environments, which any student of Jain philosophy should take into consideration. Very little work has been done in exploring how Jain philosophers were influenced by and responded to non-Jain philosophies, and even less in examining the reception of Jain philosophy by non-Jain philosophers. I hope the future of the study of Jain philosophy and Jain studies more broadly will not be only inward-looking. In line with this, it's also important seriously to consider broader social and economic contexts in which particular texts were composed, as well as the audiences for which they were intended. Investigating these various interconnections can be greatly beneficial in helping us reconstruct, to whatever extent possible, the history of Jain philosophy in greater detail, moving beyond general representations and recognizing the distinctiveness of particular authors, texts, and intellectual periods. I find studying the reception history of specific texts and authors a particularly productive line of research. It allows us to explore the relationship between tradition, reflection, and innovation. That is how representatives of the same tradition philosophically develop their inherited doctrines, and at what point and why they decide to introduce novel elements. Through this, commitments of various sorts, philosophical, sectarian, social, and so on, can become apparent. I'm currently working on the commentarial traditions of the Tattvartha Sutra. Anil is working on the reception history of Haribhadra Suri, and all three of us are also involved alongside an international group of scholars in an exciting collaborative translation project that is focused on Samanta Bhadra's Apta Mimamsa and its commentary Akalanka's Ashtashati. Since the passage we are translating is responding to non-Jain philosophical ideas, we plan to bring experts on the relevant non-Jain philosophical traditions to two panel discussions on this project we're organizing this year. The first will take place at the in-person annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion in San Diego in November, and the second at the World Sanskrit Conference in Kathmandu in December. Next year, several group members are also co-organizing a conference at UC Riverside that will examine non-Jain responses to the Jains, and we hope all these events will foster future collaborations on related topics. And this brings me to the next point I want to emphasize, and that is the importance of creating collaborative academic networks. The collaborative format of our work in the translation group has been incredibly helpful for our project. A group of scholars, each with their own specialization, brings together multiple perspectives and strengths, generates productive discussions, and if it functions as smoothly as ours has so far, can produce very solid translations. In the study of Jain philosophy, group work can be helpful both in tackling very demanding texts or larger textual projects, be it editing or translating lengthy texts, studying extensive commentary lineages, or working on projects that require different areas of expertise, such as studying particular Jain and non-Jain philosophical interactions, and projects that require knowledge of a variety of South Asian languages or different sets of skills, such as work in digital humanities, and so on. Since the production of critical editions and translations and work in digital humanities are considered less significant academic work in many academic institutions today, collaborative work and its distribution of labor also enable one to continue working on individual projects while contributing to these important field-building efforts. And here I should note that grants and Jain community donations that are aimed at providing support for particular projects, such as critical editions, translations, projects in digital humanities, and so on, be it individual or collective, or collaborative, can be especially helpful since they allow scholars to carve out more time to dedicate to such endeavors. And in the study of Jain philosophy, this kind of work is still in its initial phases. I should, of course, acknowledge that we live in an unprecedented moment for Jain studies, where with the support of the Jain community, the field is flourishing and the number of Jain studies scholars growing exponentially. And in this context, I vision all sorts of interesting connections and collaborations formed across our various subfields. All in all, I hope to see more focus on interconnections in the future developments of Jain studies, be it in illuminating the complexity of Jain philosophy and the relationship between Jain philosophers and their non-Jain interlocutors, or establishing collaborative networks that will allow us to take on complex research tasks that seem far too daunting to take on as individual projects. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I suppose it's my turn, yeah? So thank you very much, everyone, for having me here. I just want to acknowledge first that, the three of us that are speaking now, Doctors Goris and Baijel and I, are all textual scholars of Jain philosophy. And the organizers, I think, recognize that there are now quite a few very good scholars in a whole range of subfields studying Jainism in Europe and also in North America, many of whom are in the audience of this webinar right now, who have lots to say about the future of Jain studies. And so I think the decision was made to focus the discussion on philosophy. So I want to take a step back and talk about the why. What's the point of research in Jain philosophical texts at all? This is a question that can be and is raised from various quarters, both scholarly and lay or practitioner, for various reasons, and I'll try to address some of them. So first of all, I want to expand on what Dr. Goris said rightly, that the study of Indian religions has sort of already historically been unduly dominated by philosophy and certainly by textualists. But that most scholars of Indian philosophy today, I think, would agree that in a certain way, the serious study of Indian philosophy is really in its infancy in the Western world, at least. Much of what has passed for the study of Indian philosophy has been basically more what we could call sort of doxographical rather than robustly philosophical. So just kind of listing doctrines that are canonical for any given school without talking about who precisely said this, as Dr. Baijel was talking about, who precisely said this and why, and in what circumstances. And so this of course, leaves many very crucial aspects underdeveloped or ignored. First of all, the complexity and diversity within Jain philosophy, as my colleagues have already mentioned a little bit, the diversity between thinkers, because all Jain intellectuals definitely did not think or say the same things in the same ways. There were differences between thinkers, there's development and change over time, and all of this diversity has, for the most part, largely been neglected in discussions of Jain philosophy. Part of what gives rise to this complexity is context. So there's a need to study Jain philosophy in its broader intellectual environment, as Dr. Baijel was also saying. Who Jains were responding to and how they were received. Different authors are writing for different audiences, and we need to read them in those contexts. So this requires really broad and deep understanding of Jain philosophy, as well as of non-Jain philosophy, and also the range of Jain thought, life, practice, and history beyond what's strictly considered philosophy. And this is important not only for the study of Jain philosophy in itself, but also for general Jain intellectual history, because most of this category of philosophy is not one that has been strictly segregated from other categories that we segregated from in the West, in Jain and Indian tradition generally, and in South Asia, in Sanskrit discourse. Philosophy never really sort of was something that stood on its own. It was always a part of and in the background of, or in the foreground of, and incorporated by intellectuals who were doing a lot of different things. So it has to be understood in that context also. And finally, I want to say that much of what's often labeled Jain philosophy is not recognizable as philosophy by people working in philosophy departments in the West, in Europe and in North America in particular. Now, to some extent, that's not a problem with Jain philosophy. That's a problem with Western philosophy departments and their own provincial Eurocentrism, because it's true that As I just said, unlike in the West, philosophy has never been sort of strictly segregated from things like religion, for example. So there's a lot of non-Western thought that is arguably philosophical, but then gets marginalized and excluded. And so that's part of the reason why, as Dr. Bajo was saying, we need to look at a lot of different genres for philosophical thought in Jainism. But there are more capacious understandings of philosophy. And so some Anglophone analytical philosophers have themselves proposed that, one defining feature of philosophical thought is argument, producing rational arguments to address the broadest and most fundamental questions. And by this measure, there is both a lot of Jain philosophy that's been ignored, but also conversely, a lot of what's commonly called Jain philosophy is not really what modern philosophers mean by the word philosophy. So a lot of times when people talk about philosophy, when people talk about Jain philosophy or even Indian philosophy, that term often refers to sort of just lists of doctrines, whether metaphysical or ethical or whatever. But not all doctrine is philosophical, according to sort of contemporary understandings of philosophy. And simply listing things is not necessarily doing philosophy. And I think we can see that in Jain tradition itself. So this leads to a sort of a wrong impression that philosophy in Jainism or in Indian religions generally, for that matter, is just sort of dogmatic and faith-based and is not really philosophical. And that's because there's been a failure to really excavate and display the full rigor of philosophical resources in Jain tradition, in Jain argumentative discourses. So those are just a few of the things I want to say. I can say more, maybe in the question and answer period, we can talk more about, what it really looks like to do full justice to the richness of Jain philosophy and what this has to do with questions that the panel began with about engaged Jainism and different methodologies of studying Jainism. But I'll leave it there now and hand over my time to the rest of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anil, and thank you so much, Anna. That was wonderful. I still have 8 minutes allocated. I'll try to be very brief. To speak about so as a philosopher, I not only research, but I also teach philosophy, and I also try to contribute to society thanks to this, to Jaina philosophy. And here I am thrilled to be joined by Mehul Samgrashka from the Institute of Jainology. He does a lot to promote public awareness of Jainism, amongst a lot of other things. And I've invited him so that he and I could speak about the usefulness of the interactions between academics and the community on Jaina philosophy. Because yes, the history of philosophy is also the history of philosophers. Already they tried to assimilate their practice into this vision of the world. And as you know, today Jaina practices and the interpretation of sacred texts evolve very quickly. A lot of change in the lifestyles, especially for the diaspora communities, that we will hear a bit more in the last section. But still, I am based right now in the UK, and I am really blessed to be able to interact more with people for whom those texts are important, not only at the theoretical level, but also for in an everyday life way. And that really helped me a lot to understand better this text myself, actually, as a philosopher. So I just wanted to give you a few examples of the interaction I have with people from the Jain community in the UK, since I'm here, and I'm here only since September last year. But so much has already happened. And I wanted to begin with a discussion group that I attend every Saturday morning with the Sri Chandana Vidya Pit of South London. So we are reading the Chahadhala, so the 6 chapters, the 6 shields against karma of Pandit Duratram. And that's an example of a very fruitful interaction that I'm having right now, because it's really modifying my understanding of the philosophical text. For example, the real centrality and importance of karma and what it means on an everyday life level. And we also plan on organizing this September or late August a workshop with mainly with Jain practitioners to read all together a text and try to engage with it to see how all our different type of expertise. We should stop saying maybe academics and Jains at some point, but because it's not black and white. We all have different types of, different degrees of and types of expertise, and we all have different types of objectives also when we are reading those texts. And so we are planning to have this big workshop with also meditative sessions and also musical program and the like. So that's already 2 projects that are really changing my way of researching and teaching. We also have future meeting at the Vatican in early November. The theme this year will be Anekantāvada from an interfaith perspective. So I think that's also a dialogue very worth having with different faiths. And there is a huge benefit of having both practitioners and academics to represent the Jaina tradition in those dialogues, actually, which will also include yes, I think it's not only Anekantāvada as the many-sided view of reality, but also tolerance and acceptance for a more peaceful world. So just a few examples. I have a few more examples, but I would like to give a few minutes to Mehul to present some of the projects you are doing, and I will add more of mine after. So Mehul, yes, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Hello, Jayendra, and thank you so much for having me here today. Let me start by drawing an analogy that I see here. Most of you will know that Jain ascetics don't step foot outside of India because their practice is on ahimsa. But there is a symbiotic relationship between the laity and the monk. And I also believe that the same symbiotic relationship exists between the academic and the community, because there is a great need for academics, but I think the academics also probably need the community as much. And, Marie-Hélène kindly gave a few examples, but if I just expand a little bit on those. So in terms of the community, one of the things that we see here over the past 2 or 3 generations is that as our children and children's children are born in this country, their first language becomes English, which means that they don't understand the languages in which the texts are written. The way that they practice religion has changed. We talked, somebody spoke about environment and animal rights and so on. That's very true. But also, we now actually do the Jain rituals in English. Things like pratikaman are done in English. And the third is that essentially the environment in which they live is very different from the time the texts were written, which was probably largely a very agricultural type environment. So I think there's a lot to learn or a lot to gain from this sort of relationship. But also in the texts themselves, many of the things that they talk about are experiential, and also for those that are of higher orders, monks and so on. And I think those things can only be learned by understanding how the community looks at them and experiences and practices them, because I don't see often that the translations do justice to those sort of things. Secondly, the Vatican is an example of the interreligious dialogue we as a community do frequently. So we have a 2-year program with the Vatican where we meet together with their team for interreligious dialogue with the cardinal. Sometimes the Pope himself comes, and the idea here is to look at both common textual sources as well as look at practices that show commonality and build understanding and tolerance, and especially in the world that we live in. And again, it's very important for us to have academics there that contribute to this dialogue and contribute to this knowledge. And frequently this then goes out to a lot of the Catholic churches and missions. Last year, the Pope kindly published a paper which was covered by a lot of the Catholic newspapers on how the Jains are doing so much to try and save the environment and so on. So I think that's something that also helps us. And the third area that I just wanted to touch on, and I'm sure Marie-Hélène probably has a lot to say around this as well, is the fact that we interact with so many institutions that hold Jain collections, whether they're physical collections or manuscripts and so on. And you know, we've catalogued the British Library, the Wellcome collection, part of the V&A collection, etc., under the guidance of Professor Nalini Balbir, for example, which was very important for us because these are Jain books. We, as you may know, have just agreed the restitution of the Wellcome Trust collection, some 2,000 manuscripts, which we will be putting on long-term loan to Birmingham for teaching, learning, and research. And if you look at something that I hope most of you use, something called Jainpedia, again, you know, a collection of these institutions and interpreted and with articles from lots of scholars, but again, led by Nalini Balbir. For us, these are important assets, but they are all assets that we've, you know, developed with academia. And I think that is incredibly important to understand.
Thank you so much, Mehul. Yes, I think Tino, I think we are right on time to let you start the section on the communities in outside South Asia.
Okay, thank you very much, Marie-Hélène. I have a couple of slides, so I will try to get my screen share up and running. Let me see. Yes, you should be seeing a doe, which is a bird. Okay, super. Thank you very much to all of you in the audience and also to my lovely co-organizers, Chris and Marie-Hélène. We've already had such interesting ideas pass by, and although the topic being Engaged Jain Studies and then philosophy, I mean, I'd expected them to be quite different, but in a lot of things, all of our three little mini panels kind of meet each other in the end, which is quite nice and affirms the fact that Jain Studies is still sort of one field and we do share a lot of common goals and interests. So in this last section of today's event, the speakers will be myself, which is Tine, and then the order changed a little bit. So and then Venu Mehta of China, followed by Yifan Zhang, today here as Mumukshu Manek, of which he will speak a little bit himself, I'm assuming. Who is a PhD student at Ghent. But let me first give a little bit of a brief introduction. So my possible future avenue for Jain studies deals with Jainism and migration, Jainism outside of South Asia. And some of you might think, well, how is that future? You know, isn't this kind of recent past, past present? But in a way it isn't. Chris already hinted at this. So in the 90s, it was John Court who, all the way at the beginning of the 90s, published an article which dealt with models for and of the studies of the study of the Jains, but also made a distinction between the study of Jainism, which was very text-based, very philological, and really looked at doctrine only, which was sort of the predominant model for the longest time, and then the study of Jains, which sort of took a more often anthropological, sociological, or historical view of mostly the people who practice Jainism, and with that Jainism as it is practiced. So in the study of Jainism, really, if we look at the past century, the sociological study of Jainism, which is the study of Jains, really came quite late. And within that, we find studies of Jainism outside India emerging even later. So I've got a couple of names here on the slide. It's interesting to note that with Paul Dundas's The Jains, which came out in 92, it's for many, I mean, I'm sure many of you will agree, it's like up to now one of the textbooks on Jainism. It's not called Jainism though, it's called the Jains, and it might be indicative of that shift that we see from the 90s onwards, with more attention to the Jains, to practitioners of Jainism, and then within that, even more recently, really, and I've just jotted a couple of names down, studies of Jainism outside India. Now, luckily, because there's still only quite a few, and most of this work is really case studies based, even if it is comparative case studies. So it kind of gives like little tidbits of information rather than overview. Luckily, there's a lot of material that we can draw from, because Jains have been writing about their own experience with being Jain outside of South Asia, with their experience of dealing with often complex migration histories of their families. And there's Jain organizations today outside of South Asia based specifically on the experience of migration. So these are not just all Jain organizations in diaspora, but there's really quite a few of them that specifically state in their history, in their mission statement, that being Jain in North America or in the UK feeds into their events and feeds into the rationale behind their ideas. Now, I had a list, thought I'll illustrate this a little bit, about Jains writing or making movies or putting stuff up on social media based on their migration experience, but it's a really long list actually, even if you don't dig very deep. So I'm gonna have to point you to my other work on this if you want a more full idea. Now, why is it so important to look at Jainism and migration? Why is Jainism, as it develops outside of South Asia, specifically interesting to look at? In the book that was published about 2 years ago, it's by me, Digital and Diaspora, it's called, I argue that often, even unconsciously, a lot of people still seem to think that Jainism outside of India is a kind of obscure dead end, that it doesn't really change, that it only waters down, so to speak. And you find that idea present in some scholarly work, but also in the way some Jains talk about the way their tradition, in their view, is going. But it's definitely not something that is generally held. And in doing research in different places around the world and talking to a lot of Jains, because my work is by definition co-constructivist, so I really need to be able to collaborate with the Jain community. As Mehul also said, we need each other. We really do for this type of research. It's really quite dynamic. A lot of things are going on. And those of you also in the audience who are part of Jain communities outside of India will hopefully recognize this. And therefore, I argue it's interesting to look at these communities because of their influence also through endowed chairs, through being sort of the main interlocutors to scholars like our three organizers, me included, right? They influence Jain studies in a very specific and very, very, impactful way. I also find that there's an influence, or at least a connection with India there, with ideas that are developed in these diasporic communities in North America, in the UK, elsewhere. They're in dialogue with India. So it's not something that is a kind of appendix that doesn't go any further. There's a continual intellectual history of back and forth. And I really hope that this future avenue of studies in Jainism and migration develops into that, grows into a study of the global flows of Jain intellectual history. But to be able to do that, we need to first look more closely at how these connections, how also the history of migration really lies at the foundation of the situation today. And lastly, I think in the book, I make it quite clear that I think it's very rewarding to look at the developments and the discussions going on in the diaspora. as sort of a barometer of some kind. It draws attention to what are the debates of the time. So that is about as much as I want to say, because I want to give some time to my speakers. I will briefly talk you through what the rest of my slot will look like. So I will first give the floor, the digital floor, to Venu Mehta, who's, and you will see, a global Jain, but also director of the Jain Diaspora Committee. And I've asked him to do two things. I've asked him to speak a little bit about his own migration history as kind of an illustration of what is, I mean, he's very global, but his story isn't exceptional, but it is foundational. But then also to give us a glimpse of one of these Jain organizations outside of India that really works based on this idea of a diaspora, of a unified identity of Jains outside of South Asia. And then I will have a brief interview with Yifan, who is a PhD candidate of mine, and he's currently in Southeast Asia conducting ethnographic research. So that's what we'll do. The aim of this entire thing is to showcase the waves of network migration that underlie current Jain communities, and to invite reflection on how any of us really thinks about Jainism outside of India, whether we're not sometimes a bit stuck in this idea that it diverges from an orthodox Indian version, or it might be diminishing in some way, instead of really approaching this in a neutral and curious way. Lastly, I want to say I could have invited a lot of people to talk about this with me, including people like Atul Shah, like Bindi Shah as well, who would have all done lovely, but I have to make some choices somewhere. If you want to hear more Jain migration stories, I do want to point you towards Atul Shah's Facebook channel, because that is where we've parked for now some interviews under the banner of the Jain Migration History Project. So with that, I am going to close this. I'm going to give the floor to Manish, and I'm also going to switch to his presentation. So Manish, if you want me to flick a slide, you tell me, flick a slide.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Jai Janendra and Pranam. I happen to be traveling once again from my home base in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm actually in Bangalore, where I just landed this early morning. So it's a pleasure to join you from a completely different locale than I normally would be. But then it's just part of the work I do for the Jain Diaspora Committee. So can you go to the next slide, please?
I will.
And thank you, Tina, for manipulating. I wasn't sure where I'd be. Perhaps putting it on slideshow might
do you not see it move?
it up. No, I'm not seeing it move.
This is
interesting.
Let me see.
How about everybody else?
No, it's not advancing. It's also not in slideshow mode.
Oh, wait, let me stop share for a bit and I will...
Is it a separate file or is it linked to what you have here? Looks like it's a separate file. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, do you see, is it your second slide, Jain Diaspora Initiative?
Yes, but the first one is also important.
Yeah. Do
yes,
you see the first one? Okay, good. Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That works really well. Everything okay now?
It looks fine, yeah.
Your volume is a little bit
you.
low. Sorry, Manish. Your volume is a little bit low. Is it possible to speak closer to the
volume
mic?
is low. Yes, how about now?
That's better, yes. Thank you.
Better? Okay. And I guess you don't need to see me if you want me to just speak louder. Okay, so this presentation primarily, yeah, I titled it "Living, Learning, and Thriving as Jains in the Diaspora," and really it speaks to what Chris Miller began this webinar with about engaged Jainism, and I sort of tended to emphasize that in this presentation, as you'll see. So I am currently a lifetime member of the Jain Society of Greater Detroit, Michigan, as well as have been a Parshala teacher ever since I came to the United States in 1985 as a graduate student to study industrial and mechanical engineering in Cincinnati, Ohio, and then to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where at that time my wife, Varsha Mehta, and I settled for the last 35 years. Unfortunately, she passed away last year, but we spent time together after being closely involved with the Jaina Diaspora Committee, visiting Jain communities in about 15 countries around the world. So I'm currently the chair of the Jaina Diaspora Committee, the vice chair of the Academic Liaison Committee, which works to establish endowed studies in Jain programs, in Jain courses, working both at the philanthropy side as well as with the academic and the university linkages to bring Jain courses. And of course, I'm a member of the Jaina Long Range Planning Committee. I had the pleasure of seeing Professor Anna Beisel just about a month ago, actually, in Chicago at our Jaina Leadership Forum. And then I'm also on the Interfaith Committee of Jaina. So I wear several different hats. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this photo there is actually a tribute to Virchand Raghavji Gandhi, who was the inspiration, really, of a Jain who came out of his comfort zone to foreign lands so far away and just to spread the word on Jainism. So we're trying to do the same thing as contemporary Jains today in sharing Jain values and teachings with mainstream populations wherever we live around the world in the diaspora. Go forward, please. Next slide. So the purpose of the Jaina Diaspora Initiative is to promote the identity of global citizenship and one Jain, and to promote Jain unity, essentially, amongst the new generation Jains by establishing relationships that we have, both for the Jain Federation of Jain Associations in North America, but also with other Jain community leaders and institutions scattered in about 35 countries. And the beneficiaries are, of course, not only the Jain associations and our external partner organizations, but some of the typical relationships I've been able to forge and work as part of a larger team in Jaina is with the Parliament of World Religions, organizing sessions and making presentations, the Bharatiya Jain Sangathan, doing projects on poverty alleviation and promoting values-based education, Ratna Global Foundation, which does a lot of philanthropy work, not only in India, but around the world, Rotary International, one of my pet projects and organizations, and of course, with several universities and institutions, as you're aware. So the larger impact has been to share the broader message of Jain values and Jain unity, by holding joint events and participating in foreign Jain community events. And, I've been a frequent visitor. It was delightful to see my friend, Dr. Mehul Sangrajka, also a fellow East African Jain, a couple of times last year as well, at the events that One Jain UK and IOJ organized. We also partner with Jain NGOs and other contemporary groups on where it makes sense to partner and collaborate, such as education, advocacy, and addressing common causes impacting Jains. And I'm also involved with the vegan Jain movement, but now through the Rotary International organization, where we have an action group called Environmental Sustainability Rotary Action Group, and also a fellowship of vegan Rotarians. So these are some of the things I'm involved with. Let's go to the next slide. And some of my influencers, to use contemporary terminology. So this begins, I did some research to 6 generations of my father's side of the family, and I came up with a picture on the left-hand side, top left corner of Ratichandji Jain, Ratichandji Mehta, who was a feudal, lord or zamindar in a little village called Badi Sadri, just 30 kilometers south of Chittorgarh in Rajasthan state. But then the more contemporary influences have been my own 2 grandmothers, who, as you can see, are very strict Jains, or were very strict Jains. My maternal grandmother shown there, both Shwetambar Stanakwasi Jains. So my maternal grandmother in the white there with the mupati, and then my paternal grandmother in the black, the Rajasthani style. So I had a Gujarati Jain grandmother, and my nanima, and my dadima was a Rajasthani Jain. practitioner, very strict. And of course, there in the colorful sari and the suit, there is my own parents who lived in Singapore, India, East Africa, for about 60 plus years outside of India, through multiple postings my dad had as an insurance executive. And then in the middle is the photo of my current family, my wife Varsha and my two older sons, with the Chicago skyline where the sons are settled currently. And then on the last but not least, on the right-hand side is me as the grandpa, 6-week-old grandfather, with our next generation firstborn, Mira, there in my hands. Let's go to the next slide, Steve. So I think I want to illustrate with this how we have been able to promote and pass on Jain values through multiple generations of families and still try and do good in the world, along with trying to achieve our own purposes, as Jains. So my journey of in the diaspora began in Jaipur, Rajasthan, where I was born in 1961. And then in 1965, my father got transferred to Tanzania on his job as an insurance executive. From there, in 1968, my family moved to Kampala, Uganda. And then in 1972, we moved from Kampala to Bangalore, India, where I did my middle school. So elementary schooling was done in East Africa, middle school in Bangalore, India. And then high school, we moved in 1975 to 1980 in Singapore. So, and then from there, I once again finished high school and moved back to Bangalore to do my engineering bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering in Bangalore. And from there, I got a scholarship, all expenses paid, to study robotics and automation at University of Cincinnati. So the last arrow on the right-hand side, you see, it brings me to the shores of America since 1985, which is where my home is currently. And I now live in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So lots of milestones here, and as I mentioned, that the first bullet is taken care of. The other second bullet is that somehow I got very closely involved with teaching Jain Pathshalas in Cincinnati while a grad student, and then while a young parent in the Detroit Jain Temple Pathshalas. So I have about 15 years of Pathshala teaching experience, trying to teach values, trying to teach kids to be prosperous, but also to give back and to be, conscientious of the world around them. So that was part of my Pathshala experiences as I taught these children of many, many families. Then after that, ours was the only Jain family featured in the Smithsonian Museum's first ever exhibit on Indian Americans beyond Bollywood. So you might know Dr. Masoom Momaya, who was a curator at one time in the Smithsonian, and she helped put this exhibit together, but also gave a lot of tribute to Vichandra Gandhi and several Jain families in there. Besides that, I've been very closely associated with the Rotary International centers for various humanitarian projects, etc. And I've been an active Rotarian. I'm a second generation Rotarian. My dad was a Rotarian since 1953, from Udaipur to East Africa to Bangalore to Singapore. And then I joined Rotary, which is the world's oldest and largest organization of professional men and women engaged in service. It was founded in 1905 out of Chicago and continues to thrive. And actually, next week from Bangalore, I'm headed to Singapore for the Rotary International Convention, which is being held starting third week of May. But the point is that I have been able to leverage both my Jain background and Jain connections. Many Jains are leading businessmen and industrialists, are actually Rotarians as well around the world. And I've been able to leverage all these relationships to institute humanitarian programs. And to date, I have received about $1 million of Rotary International Foundation grants that covered 22 different projects on doing good in the world, essentially, wherever it made sense to get involved. So, and I've also volunteered on polio eradication and water and sanitation projects over the years, and many other things in this side. The other thing I've tried to do is to teach our children, as well as the children in the diaspora countries, how to, institute Jain values in the countries or communities they live in. So one example is a Jeevdaya bird feeder project. We took it to the largest retirement community home in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where there's intensive care and dementia wards, etc. And my family and I put bird feeders on the windows of these of the shut-in individuals who live, the aged individuals in these nursing homes. And we were able to refill bird feeders every week. So I could teach the children compassion and caring for all at that point, early in their lives. And the last bullet down there is I was the first Jain to be in North America to be able to recite the Namokar mantra and Maitri Bhavana prayer, which has now become a viral video for the last 4 or 5 years in the Michigan State House of Legislature. And after that, we have inspired and helped Jains settled in Arizona and California, Maryland, and Minnesota to also do the same thing. So we're trying to get Jains, to be more visible around the world. Next slide, please. And I will try and speed up further if I can go. So my point is that, regardless of what stage of life you're in, with the cartoon on the left, there are ways to both minimize our karmic footprint, but also use the moral, background that we have on nonviolence and thought, word, and action to promote our Jain values in multiple different ways. And I happen to my wife was actually a Brahmin Hindu born, but she was able to adapt Jainism so much so and instituted in a practice that even last year when she passed in hospice due to cancer, she actually took the Jain vow of Samtara by listening to the Jain Vishwabharati Samnijis for several days as she was contemplating how to, move on to the higher, goals and moksha marg. So next slide, please. So I have a very long engineering journey, which I will not talk about. It is all around commercializing new technologies and materials into advanced manufacturing applications. I've always looked at lightweighting and advanced materials and coatings and nanotechnologies as the basis of promoting new, lighter weight, lower emissions, lower carbon footprint materials into the automotive and the defense manufacturing industry. So that's the bottom line here. Let's go to the next slide, please. And then the humanitarian journey I talked about has been my passion ever since I became a professional. And even in grad school, I used to visit nursing homes to cheer people in shut-ins and listen to their stories while I was in Cincinnati, Ohio. So that's the top right photograph. And then on the bottom left side, I worked on polio eradication in villages outside of Bangalore in 1997, and I brought a delegation of American Rotarians for that. On the right-hand side, just describing activism in polio eradication, because Ann Arbor, the town where I currently live in America, was the place where the announcement of the Salk vaccine, polio vaccine, was made, that was then implemented worldwide in the early 1960s. And that's the immediate past president of Rotary International, Jennifer Jones, there on my left. Next slide, please. So yes, we talked about bird feeders, so I'll say no more. I've also involved in our own community when our city council decided to go out and they thought there was a burgeoning population of deer in our neighborhoods in Ann Arbor. I was amongst those who partnered with other Jains in our community and other like-minded organizations, including one called the Lighthouse Institute, which is based out of Ann Arbor. Gurudev Chitrabhanu and Pramodaben actually were involved in inspiring and teaching about 300 Americans about Jainism and Jain values. So I partnered with the disciples of Gurudev Chitrabhanu to help stop the killing of deer in our community by the city council. So this is just an example of the kind of activism and engagement I've had. Next, please.
I was just wondering whether, because there is only 1 minute left for Yifan, so I'm just stepping in a bit. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much.
No. We keep moving on. So you've seen this one. I've done about again, with partnership with Rotary Foundation, several projects in humanitarian work, including Ramakrishna Ashram. Next slide, please, in Calcutta area. And then, you see Dr. Cogen Jain, because we got involved closely with trying to do 500 clinical trials with recycled and harvested pacemakers in India. So he took me to see several of the top cardiac surgeons in India to work on this. Next slide, please. So you see Devi Shetty, who was Mother Teresa's cardiac surgeon, and then Dr. Naresh Trehan there. Besides that, on the environmental side, I've done projects with the Jane Goodall Institute on biodiversity through Rotary, and then Kailash Satyarthi on the other side on child slavery and activism. And of course, now next week, I'll be seeing Dr. Jack Sim, who's the founder of World Toilet Organization. And I must pay tribute to my dear UK Jain friends. So as Mehul mentioned about Cardinal Louis Turan, when he visited, I was invited by Dr. Harshad Sangrajka to connect with the Vatican individuals from the Interreligious Council. So I think with that, I'm pretty much done with this presentation. I apologize for going over. Thank you very much.
Don't worry about it. Thank you so much, Manishji, for giving us such a vivid impression of how these global networks work and how Jain ideas of engagement, social engagement, other types of engagement kind of travel along these nodes and along these overseas connections, some of them overtly Jain, others maybe Rotary steered a little bit, if I can say so. So I'm going to take a couple of more minutes because I want to have a brief interview with my student and colleague, Yifan. Yifan, you're here? Yes. Okay, super. Who is at the moment in Southeast Asia? So
yes, I'm here.
Super. So we'll take a couple of minutes. What I wanted to ask you to sort of briefly talk about, Yifan, is give us an idea of these communities of Jains in Southeast Asia and what it has been like for you to do research there.
Okay. Actually, I have my answers briefly written down on the papers of my notebook. So now I'm going to have elaboration together with what I've written, perhaps with the few extra information. So let me begin. Southeast Asia has been a hub for cultural interaction, religions, connection, and the movement of people for a significant period of time. Even today, the region remains true to its vibrant history. South Asia has a long history of close commercial and cultural connections with India, dating back to ancient times as Buddhism gained popularity in Southeast Asia. There has been ongoing discussion about the presence of Jainism in the region. As I observed at France Guimet Museum, there's a debate surrounding the significance of a Central Javanese statue, whether it represents a Buddha or a Jaina. In modern times, this spread of Jainism from India to Southeast Asia was facilitated by improvement of transportation and as well as communication, and also the influence of the British colonizers. Jain merchants, particularly those from Gujarat, found their way to several urban hubs in Southeast Asia, including Yangon, Malacca, Penang, and Singapore. The Jain temple and the Jain community in Yangon have a rich history. However, the political instability in Myanmar has had a significant negative impact on their prominence. Today, only a few Jain families remain in Yangon, along with their heritage temple. This serves as a reminder of the once thriving Jain communities in Yangon. The Jain communities in Singapore and Malaysia have a deep connection with each other, both in the past and in the present. Being significant port cities and trading hubs along the Strait of Malacca. Malacca, Penang, and Penang in Malaysia, Singapore have been home to Southeast Asian Jains for long, as Singapore Jains proudly claim that Jain history in Singapore spans over the century. Today, the Jain communities in Malaysia and Singapore are made up of both settlers and sojourners. Many Indians have migrated to these countries as expats to work and run their businesses. The Jain settlers and sojourners in the bustling city of Kuala Lumpur tend to reside in close proximity to one another in the downtown area. However, there is currently no established Jain institution in Kuala Lumpur. In Singapore, the Jains have a centralized community that operates within the framework of Singapore's IRO. So IRO is interreligious organization. This allows for different varieties of Jains to come together under one umbrella. Meanwhile, the Jain communities in Bangkok and Jakarta consist entirely of expatriates. These expats hailing from Gujarat, Marwar, and Bundelkhand are actively involved in running businesses related to diamonds, colored stones, and textiles in Bangkok and Jakarta, respectively. And I feel a strong sense of familiarity in Southeast Asia, as if I've returned to a place I know well. Having extensively explored Southeast Asia in the past, I have gained valuable insights through living, studying, and establishing personal connections in the region. However, it is important to acknowledge that the entire process is not without a challenge. Alongside the valuable insights, moment of joy, and deep contemplation, there are also moments of unease, uncertainty, and the emotional struggle. Undertaking the comprehensive research fieldwork of this nature requires unwavering determination, enthusiasm, and capacity to confront challenges head-on and find solutions. It is important to find moments of joy amidst hardship, as it can be challenging to pervasive without love. I'm constantly reminded of the wonders of exploring Jainism and Jain community, which fills my heart with a sense of curiosity and dedication. When
That's a very
working in the
nice thing
field,
to
it
say.
is crucial to navigate.
Yifan, I'm going to stop
navigate.
you to insert the next question. Otherwise, we're going to go over time a little bit too much. You said that
I
there's
think I'm
a
already in the
difference.
second question.
You said there's a clear difference in these communities today between settlers who've been there for a good long while and who might identify as Southeast Asian Jains, and then sojourners who are the expats who might identify as Jains who happen to now live in Southeast Asia. Do you see that to the same extent in all these different countries, in Malaysia and in Singapore and Thailand? And what other things kind of jump out at you as being specific to this Southeast Asian context?
Okay, so to talk about the most striking thing I've discovered in Southeast Asia fieldwork so far. So for that question, I have a few points. So the first one is I'm very much interested in exploring the significance of Burma, Myanmar, particularly the city of Rangoon or Yangon in the migratory patterns and histories of the Jain community in Southeast Asia. This is perhaps that area that I can plan to delve into in the future. And this topic is often overlooked. There is a book called, Nortiba Statue that explores the Jain history in Burma, Myanmar, but the connections between Burmese or Myanmarese Jain and the Jains in other Southeast Asian regions with Jain population are really explored or studied. Because I've realized there are connections even between the previous British colonies of a British colony of Burma and British colonies of Malaya and Singapore. Even during that period of time, they already had quite close connections with one another. So the second point is something that caught my attention between the Jain community's history in Malaysia and the role of Malacca as the previously central hub for Jain settlers in Malaysia and Singapore, and the Jain interconnectivity among the major Malaysian cities of Kuala Lumpur, Penang, Malacca, and Ipoh, as well as with Singapore. When discussing with the Jain history and present in Southeast Asia, the case of Malaya or Malaysia and Singapore stand out as particularly noteworthy. These regions offer a wealth of stories and details waiting to be explored.
Okay, super. I think we're gonna have to leave it there, Yifan, but thank you very much and a lot of good luck to you as you complete your fieldwork there. So I think I'm gonna, thank you. I think I'm gonna hand it over back to, well, we can share it, but back to Chris and or Marie-Hélène, and let's have a look at the questions. Because we have one sent in by John Court, who couldn't be here today, so maybe we should start with that. And I think, Chris, it's in front of you.
Yes, I'm happy to share the floor. I don't want to hog it here, but maybe I'll just read the question and let you all reflect on this question that John Court said with regard to the project, or with regard to the event specifically, because he could not be here. He's giving a presentation at the same time. Jain Studies is truly a burgeoning field, as you see. So John Court writes, in an essay published long ago, 1990, in Method and Theory in the Study of Religion, I discussed the difference between the study of the Jains and the study of Jainism. One could argue that a major factor in bringing the field into the mainstream of South Asian studies in the 1980s and 1990s was the shift in focus from the latter to the former, especially seen in the work of the anthropologists and historians who were at the forefront of the field at that time. This is also reflected by Paul's decision to title his book, The Jains. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. I'll post that in the chat as well, but I'll turn it over to my colleagues if they want to respond to this question.
I'm not sure I'm more qualified for that, but just very briefly, my opinion, what I was trying to show in our discussion on philosophy is that we need both today. There was too much of a focus on Jainism, and it's really, it was so welcome and important that now we have focused on the Jains, and now it's good to have an interaction going all together to try to understand some of the, what I call Jainism, like the principles that you can see in some of the texts. And try to see, as I was saying, philosophy, history of philosophy is also the history of philosophers, how this gets assimilated and how the worldview are also developed to try to give an account of what we should pursue these lines of practices and not other ones. So for me, it's a constant interaction, and I'm happy that we had both focus and now we can really, go on with them.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me as well. But his comment with sort of that shift, making Jainism also bringing it closer or bringing it into religious studies as a total discipline. I find that a bit difficult because I'm not entirely sure I know all the details of how the study of religion has developed in North America, but I think at least in a European context, I mean, it's not that strange that the focus remained on doctrine, on text for that long. I mean, you see this in other South Asian, but also just European traditions as well, that there's this Abrahamic need for a central text, and if there isn't one, we'll find one, right? So timing wise, I'm not sure if that idea checks out on both sides of the Atlantic. It might, I'm not sure, but it is true that we do need both. I always say that, I'm interested in Jain texts, but only in as far as the Jains today are interested and use them as texts. And what they do with them, what importance they give to them. But for that, you do need to actually be able to read and interpret the text. You do need to have an idea of what texts there are in the entire context of these texts, the context they inhabit, really. But I do feel, I mean, I'm in my own research is really rather Jain, not Jainism focused. But you do need both. And I think we need specialists in both. And I think we need to mainly sort of train ourselves to not be afraid of each other, to collaborate and to find the textual specialists who are willing to also engage in a more anthropological study or even more opportunities lie in collaborating with specialists in different fields on a Jain topic, which is why a lot of these new the books that have come out, also in Assistant Life, for example, are absolutely great because they do just that. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Sure, thank you. I think I'm on board with this, and I've thought a lot about John's work in a similar way, in that being trained in the North American Academy in an interdisciplinary group for the study of religion, we were always engaging with work from various fields that spoke to this in various ways. And one of the things that always emerged was the social lives of texts. And particularly in my other field of yoga studies, this is something that we consider: the social, how are these texts being used historically within context, the way they're being interpreted and received in different ways in different histories, as Anna Bajel had spoken about before, as well as how they're being used in the contemporary moment from anthropological, cultural, and ethnographic perspectives. And so I think on the one hand, there's a Jainism that's constantly being created, and scholars can take various approaches to how they study that. And I guess that's sort of what we tried to bring out in the Engaged Jainism approach, is you can either help reproduce that emic discourse, you can kind of objectively try to understand and show how that discourse is coming together anthropologically and historically, or you can do some kind of combination of the both, of really appreciating the philosophical discourse, engaging in the engagement with the Jain texts, but doing it kind of self-reflexively, and understanding your particular place in doing so. So yeah, that's all I had to say about that. We did have some other questions I can throw out from the chat. And did you want to go ahead, Tina, and field the next one?
No, I was just wondering, because I think it was Anil who said he might have a couple of comments which tie together Stephen's question in the chat and John's question in the email. So maybe we should listen it there.
Yes.
Yeah, should I read Steve's question? I guess, since I have the floor. Steve says, thank you for your defense of the need for anthropological and historical studies of Jainism as a lived religion, Mehul, which would indeed at a minimum help us, that is academics and interested engagers, continue to take Jain interpretations of Jain texts into account. And Manish, I am so delighted to see and hear about your personal historical journey and to see your grandmothers so prominently featured in your own story, as Anil, was also delighted to see that. Steve goes on, so here's Steve's question. How do we get donors who fund research to care about these approaches to Jain traditions and practices? I think by these approaches, he means anthropological and historical studies of Jainism as a lived religion. Given donors' interest in this study and application of quote-unquote philosophy, how can we develop a platform for the distribution of donor-contributed funds to a wider disciplinary array of studies of Jain traditions, especially as other sources of funding in humanities and social sciences continue to shrink? Steve asked this question
with all his immense respect to his colleagues who study philosophy, who do so with the greatest academic rigor that can be found anywhere in their discipline. Thank you, Steve. The feeling is mutual, all respect, and a characteristically excellent question. I just thought, I mean, I don't, I am not an expert fundraiser, so I don't have, you know, the most detailed advice to offer on this. But I just wanted to tie this together with the responses to John's question before by saying that, so on the one hand, you know, the study of philosophy can be understood as the study of Jainism and only Jainism, in the ways that, you know, John has tended to talk about, you know, Jain philosophers as ideologues who are involved in constructing Jainism as an ism, in contradistinction to what real normal Jains actually do. That's what that's one way to look at it. I tend to think, and I think that's an important distinction to draw, the distinction that he drew all those years ago. But I think for the reasons that for a lot of the reasons that a lot of you have just raised in response to that question, that binary is not so simple. And I think what we can and need to continue to do is to, even while bearing that, you know, that conceptual binary in mind and using it in order to trouble sort of the historically, you know, business as usual ways of doing things methodologically, we also need to show how both these things that have been pointed out. First of all, the ways that contemporary Jains are, that, you know, Jains are informed by Jainism. So this kind of dialogue, you know, and constantly evolving appropriation and interpretation of tradition, of sort of, you know, official ideological tradition, let's say, by contemporary Jains in all sorts of different contexts and for all sorts of different purposes, how that works. And so point out that, you know, Jainism is an evolving tradition that has tradition and appropriates and extends tradition by, you know, by particular individual Jains and communities. Conversely, also pointing out, as I was, you know, saying, that the Jainism that has been constructed traditionally, historically, as an ideology, was constructed by Jains, by individual Jains and by Jain communities. And there are, of course, a lot of issues about, you know, having exactly the social historical data on this to understand exactly how, you know, who these individual Jains were and how they did this, how these communities did this. But I think, you know, that is really, it's by getting more fine-grained in this way and thinking about these interactions, that we can really show how we all sort of need to be collaborating interdisciplinarily. And so, you know, just supporting sort of or just thinking about one methodological approach that is, you know, just, let's say, the study of philosophy, or on the other hand, just the study of history, is insufficient, that we need to be supporting all of these different prongs. That's all I want to say. And I think, I think we can, that's the sort of case we can make to anyone who's interested in supporting this. That's all. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anil, for synthesizing the conversation so well with Steve Vo's question. Thank you, Steve, for your question. And I know Mehul also wanted to contribute to the answer here. Mehul, please.
Yes, I just want to explain why I think both are important. I mean, when you think about Jainism, Jain texts until probably the mid-19th and 20th century were limited to the Jain monastic traditions. And in fact, in many of those traditions, only the male monks could actually access and read those texts. And so it's, you know, it's a very recent field of study, you know, the study of Jain texts. But in that, the other issue that perhaps comes up is that there is no prescription in Jainism for one to get to a point and have this experience called samyak darshan, or enlightenment, or an enlightened worldview, that then leads to a monastic, you know, type of inclination in life. And so what you see is a lot of practices in the lay community that are there, that are different, that are evolving, and that are practiced by various aspects of the communities. I think in terms of study, it's important to consider both the Jains as a community and what they do and how they do it, as well as Jainism, the philosophy, which is largely, as you know, around the human condition, and it's the liberation of the eternal soul from this physical body. And I think both are equally important. That's just my point of view. Thanks.
Thank you, Mehul. Wonderful. As a kind of maybe final question here, we'd love to go on and on, but we wanted to leave limited time for discussion. Atul Shah, one of our colleagues, dear colleagues there here in Europe, asks this. He says, excellent and stimulating panel, many thanks. Very impressive leadership and collaboration, which is a joy to see. Two huge dimensions for research and teaching, which are still barely scratched, are Jain business practices, leadership, and Jain art. The artistic dimension is huge and very rarely is it seen as a core to Jain studies. How can these two keys be ignited, please? And I'll just briefly say, Atul, that we, of course, are featuring your work on business ethics, Ben Zank's work on business ethics in the Engaged Jainism volume, and I actually have a chapter on Jain art. So there will be more of this, but I would also open it up to our panel here to see how we can continue to potentially expand these things from our particular methodological perspectives.
And maybe I can jump on this occasion to say that even though this session was titled The Future of Jain Studies, it's really selected futures of Jain Studies. We each presented only our specialities. As you could see, we are totally aware that we have left untouched a lot of very other disciplines which are equally important ones. So thank you very much for your important question on this.
Can I jump in a little bit? I think it again comes back to what's been said before, also by Anil so eloquently. We need to set up collaborations, and I'm nodding at Marie-Hélène, who's on my screen right now. So that's a collaboration, for example, between a philosopher and someone who's more or less an anthropologist with some textual baggage, and that kind of collaboration tends to work because we're sort of maybe kind of in approximate fields, and we find ourselves also institutionally close together. Setting up a project which looks at Jain business ethics tends to be really difficult because there's just more of a distance between ways of doing this, ways of thinking, and institutional distance. Right. So, for example, at Ghent, we now have a master's student and hopefully in the future a PhD student looking at Jain art. But that's only made possible because by kind of pure chance, we attracted an archaeologist and an art historian a couple of years ago, who was previously working on more sort of Buddhist archaeology, but who is kind of open to branching out and looking at Jainism. But it's difficult to set these things up and to broaden the network to include these themes. But it is something that I do really feel strongly we should do, because the more perspectives we can bring to this, the better and the more multi-perspectivist our view of Jainism in all its myriad interconnected sort of glory will be.
Well, thank you, Tine and Marie-Hélène, my collaborators here. I think what we really wanted to bring out in this event, as Marie-Hélène also just said, that the future of Jain study is multifaceted. There are futures, plural, right? And there are many methodologies. And the other thing we really wanted to emphasize in this event was collaboration and engagement, not only with each other as scholars, but with the community, and really kind of blurring the lines and doing that in a rigorous way that would not only benefit European Jain studies, but make Jain studies as a global endeavor continue to grow and expand as it is. And so with that, I don't think we have much more time unless anybody wanted to say any final words. Marie-Hélène or Tine, did you want to say anything about what's coming up a little bit for next year, or should we close it out?
Maybe we should close it up right now, but we will soon be back and we will soon announce more. Yes.
Yeah, well, from my part, as always, thank you so much to my wonderful collaborators and all our panelists and everyone who's joined online in this session or the previous ones. This has been really enriching, and we will be back with episode 2 in the next academic year. But I think for me as well, we can close it here.
Thank you
Wonderful.
so much, everyone. Thank you.
Judge and end, everyone. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you soon.
See you soon.
See you soon.